thanks everyone for being here. And shout out to all the millions on YouTube as well. Oh, I can, great. Thank you. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on Whadjuk Noongar country and pay my respects to Noongar elders past, present and future. And I extend that acknowledgement to all Noongar participants in the room here today, not least of all Professor Kim Scott, Mandy Downing. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the work that we're going to see some of today has been produced on and for the Wirlomin Noongar community. So I acknowledge this community on the south coast of WA also. So by way of introduction, I haven't started my, sorry. So by way of introduction, my name is Samya Jabbour. I'm a PhD candidate, as Andrew said, in the Curtin School of Makasi and DBE, so that's Cultural Studies and Geography. So I have a professional background in environmental management and spatial science and reporting, but a series of life-changing events a few years ago led me to pursue a PhD in decolonising environmental custodianship. I transferred my PhD to Curtin in 2021, and late last year I was invited by Professor Kim Scott and the Wirlomin Noongar community to produce a digital mapping platform to support their cultural heritage. So I'm a non-Indigenous woman here on Noongar Budja, and I'm also a first-generation Australian displaced from and unable to live on my ancestral country due to settler colonialism elsewhere. So I take seriously my responsibility in this place and my commitment to decolonial practice on this country. Professor Kim Scott, of course, needs no introduction. He's a highly acclaimed writer, poet and novelist, and twice recipient of the Miles Franklin Award. But also, and perhaps more importantly, Kim Scott is a respected elder in the Wirlomin Noongar community and is answerable to the senior elders and community on the south coast. So those watching in person here today will be treated with a live demonstration afterwards, which won't be recorded, which Kim will direct us through. So the project Mapping Wirlomin, Dwoort Baal Kaat, is the first few weeks of really a multi-year collaboration with Wirlomin Noongar Language and Stories project. And the story of Dwoort Baal Kaat originated somewhere between 60,000 years ago and the beginning of time. It's a creation story etched into the landscape and the psyche of the Wirlomin Noongar ancestral country and community. But this is also the story of its reclamation from the ashes of a brutal colonial history on WA's south coast and the remarkable healing power of community. Mapping Wirlomin is the result of at least 20 years of research and community development work by Wirlomin Noongar Language and Stories, and more than 200 years of safeguarding from settler colonial repression before that. And this is the first time in its history that this creation story has been put on the map in digital form. So I haven't felt any pressure at all. But given all you've just heard, I'm hoping that you can cut us some slack by remembering that what you're about to see is really just the result of the first 10 weeks of, this iteration. So this internship project has been a really wonderful first step into how we digitise this archive. So along with the legacy of the Wirlomin Noongar Language and Stories, this project really sits within an emerging discipline of Indigenous and decolonial digital mapping. So Indigenous data sovereignty is a new term for an old concept, really, but it's defined here as the rights of Indigenous people to exercise ownership over Indigenous data. Ownership of data can be expressed through the creation, collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination, and reuse of Indigenous data. So the Wirlomin elders are particularly concerned to consolidate their heritage in its home community. So protecting the digital privacy, protecting data sovereignty for the Wirlomin community and data privacy were really at the top of my list of priorities when I was doing this project. The early stages of this project really involved a lot of me and Kim talking through what was possible, what the archive looked like, what the mapping software was capable of, what was needed to merge the two together. And that process took about 4 weeks, I would say, of us kind of getting a handle on what was possible, what we had, what we needed to present. So Kim had the unenviable job of working through a really massive archive that's been collected over many, many years. And I was working on building a spatial database in GIS, or QGIS. I deliberately use QGIS because it is a open source free software which is almost identical to the ArcGIS, which is used in universities, but so basically I'm trying to make it accessible for the community to use down the track. So it was, as I mentioned, really important to make sure that Wirlomin data privacy was protected, and how could we make sure that that was done. And it wasn't until 4 weeks in that I realised what I was trying to do was actually 4 different projects, and this HIVE project was one of them, and that is to how do we digitally represent this kind of spatial data for an audience. Not that that's going to be a public audience. At the moment, that's a very private audience just for the Wirlomin community. But in the future, what kind of technology is possible to allow that? So I've stopped the methods here because I hit a really important stumbling block, which was Mapbox was presented as a mapping platform. And those of you who had the privilege of seeing Grace's demonstration earlier will see what Mapbox is capable of. It's a really fantastic program for digitising maps and telling stories through the map. But given the data sovereignty issues that I needed to contend with, I read the licensing agreements and I came across this ownership clause. And the first one says that you retain the ownership of all the content. That's called your content. But the second point says, but you hereby grant Mapbox a non-exclusive, worldwide, royalty-free, fully paid up, transferable and sub-licensable right and license to use, cache, copy, publish, display, distribute, modify, create derivative works and store your content, etc. So this was a major stumbling block. I realised I can't use this program as it is designed. So I did some research and I got in touch with an Indigenous mapping organisation called Terra Stories, who actually work with, they've set up Indigenous mapping platforms for use with Indigenous groups in the Amazon rainforest. And I asked how, because they use Mapbox in their, for their mapping platforms. So I asked how they get around that clause, given that data privacy is really important to them as well. And they actually hadn't heard about that clause. So we've since been, we had a really interesting conversation over from here to the Amazon to look at how they got around this. And through that collaboration, I actually understood how it was possible to use Mapbox offline. And so it is possible to pull the functionality of Mapbox down. There's two things that happen. One is that the fancy mapping software gets pulled down, and the other thing that can happen is you load data up onto the map. So I didn't load any data, any sensitive data onto the map. I was only using it to download mapping data down from the map. It may not make sense just yet. But I realised that it was actually possible to work offline and to work safely with this mapping platform, which is what I then did. So from there, around 4 weeks in, I started to look at Mapbox. So bear in mind, I had to look at how to use this program safely before I'd ever used this software before. So it was quite a stressful process to look at, well, how do I keep this data safe when I've never used this program before. So that took some time. But once we started to realise what was possible with Mapbox, we then started to refine the story. And then Kim started to draft a script, and between us we started to refine the scope, and we continued to build these chapters in Mapbox, working offline. So some of the outcomes that you'll see in the live demonstration, there's basically 3 stages to the demonstration. The first is just an opening scene. So the one on the left here shows a bit of a taste of what's to come. But then the first half of the presentation, the map looks like a conventional map. So the map goes flat, north is at the top, and it's an aerial view. So this is what we'd call a conventional, a mapping convention. And I realised actually that Mapbox was one of the few softwares that I know that can actually move that north convention on a map. So it's got some really powerful characteristics. But I deliberately tried to make the first part of the story quite flat and quite with north at the top and with English language. And then as we move in, you'll see the story change quite dramatically. And as we move into the story, the map begins to come alive. We haven't quite got there yet, but this is what we were aiming for, was to bring that landscape alive, to move into 3D terrain modelling, and to use mostly Noongar language instead of English. So some of the advantages of this approach are that it's been a really powerful way to use a map to tell a story. Mapbox has some really impressive functionality, which, to be honest, I'm really only touching the surface of. I would love to have the opportunity to explore this a lot more. It's relatively easy to operate. It's designed for use by journalists and, not coders, basically. So people who, like me, have not done coding before, it's relatively simple to use. And I used it mainly offline. And when I say mainly, I mean that the only thing I'm needing to be online for is to drag those maps down. So I'm not loading anything up to it. And this is what the code looks like. So one of the shortcomings of this approach, and Grace touched on this earlier as well, is that because I wasn't putting any, I wasn't drawing any boundaries, if you like, or anything onto the map, as I mentioned, I was using the extent of the screen to roughly show the geographic area of the areas that I was interested in. But as Grace also mentioned, that completely falls over when you put it on a different screen, because the screen aspect changes the whole geographic display. I tried it on this screen, which is very, very long, and this area ended up all the way to New Zealand. And and way out in the Indian Ocean. So that, that was a big wake-up call that actually, yeah, this is very specific at the moment to the screen that it's being played on, but I think there's a way to hack that in future. So the difficult parts were definitely the coding errors. As a very new person to coding, this was a big learning curve. So any comma, any bracket, any, God forbid, apostrophe in the wrong place will just crash the whole system and turn it white, and there's absolutely no clue about where the problem is. So trying to find the problem is literally like looking for a needle in a multi-thousand line code of haystack of code, whatever that is. The other problem I encountered was that so some of the map functionality was incredibly easy and some was really surprisingly difficult. So because of the way that I had chosen to use it, I was using imagery overlaid on top of a bare map, and that allowed me to protect the data from going onto the map. But you'll see in the demonstration there are a number of times in there where I've aligned the background map with the foreground image. But to do that was surprisingly difficult actually, because it's the map, the image is in a fixed position, so I had to move the map under it. But if you can, I know there are a few geographers in the room who might appreciate this, but to do that I had to think about, okay, so there's the map needs to move a little bit to the right. So therefore, the centre point of the map needs to move a little bit to the left. And therefore, the easting needs to get a little bit smaller. And by how many, roughly, decimal degrees? Like this was all kind of quite mirrored calculations I was trying to do. But generally speaking, the mapping was quite lovely. As in the process of doing it was quite straightforward. So the best parts have certainly been the collaboration with Kim Scott. I feel extremely privileged to have had such a close collaboration and sharing of such an extraordinary archive. It's been an extraordinary privilege to have been trusted by the Wirlomin community to hold this data and to be able to just start to touch how precious it is to be able to tell such an important story through in a digital way, in a very new way. So obviously this is just the start of what's possible, and yeah, I can't imagine I could ever do it justice in 6 weeks or 10 weeks, but yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for this to inform how we go ahead in future. So thank you. Thank you to Kim Scott. Thank you to the Wirlomin community. Thank you to the HIVE, to my mentors, Wesley and Carley and Andrew, and all of you looking here today. Thank you so much.